work over the years very, very much. Rebecca Vilkomerson is, among other things, the former executive director of Jewish Voice for Peace, which has been very much in the news in this last year, of course. She is currently an activist, the co-director of a group called Funding Freedom, and the co-author with Rabbi Alissa Wise of a new book, Solidarity is the Political Version of Love. And I wanted to talk to her about that book and catch up with her now. So first of all, Rebecca, thanks for coming back on the program.
It's so nice to be back.
Well, it's good to have you. And let's start with the book. You and Rabbi Wise have prepared this. It seems to me, reading it, that it is a combination of the experiences you gathered with Jewish Voice for Peace and the Jewish peace movement and Palestinian rights movement in general, and then using that as a model for other forms of organizing. Is that a fair summary, you think?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful summary. The subtitle of the book is Lessons from Jewish Anti-Zionist Organizing. And I think one thing we wanted to do was this was an offering to our movement, to the Jewish wing of the Palestinian Solidarity movement. But also we've both been organizers for a long time. And in the years since we've each left JVP, we've worked with other organizations that are doing similar kinds of work. Like Hindus for Human Rights is one of them. Showing Up for Racial Justice is another. And each of them are organizing within their own communities to try, in a very challenging situation where we're trying to, like we were at Jewish Voice for Peace and continue to do at Jewish Voice for Peace, to organize within our own communities to shift the narrative and shift the center of power, and ultimately to help make policy change as part of a broader multiracial movement. And so we really wanted to try to apply the lessons that we felt we learned from our work at Jewish Voice for Peace to a broader audience.
And, it seems to me that, as you well know, movement building, the more your movement and your cause threatens the status quo, the more challenging it can be on a personal level. And I suspect that's part of the reason for your quote, for your title, which is taken from a quote, Solidarity is the Political Version of Love. It makes me think of the great civil rights thinker, strategist, and activist Ella Baker saying, who are your people? That to build a movement and sustain a movement, it can't be a bunch of little me's, it's got to be us. And it seems to me that's an essential lesson that I get from your book. Is that fair?
Well, yeah, I'm glad to hear that, because that is definitely what we were hoping. I will say the title, Solidarity is the Political Version of Love, we didn't make that up. It's actually a quote from a very beloved Jewish feminist author, Melanie K. Kantrowitz. And like the fuller quote is the epigraph at the very beginning of the book. And so we really wanted to sort of honor our ancestors. And we thought that that was sort of the perfect encapsulation of the way that JVP has done its work over the years. And, the sort of opening chapter of the book is about building political home. And I think as organizers, the two of us as authors and also JVP organizationally has spent a lot of time over the years in thinking about the ways that, especially if we're asking people in our own community who have been brought up often with synagogues in Jewish communities, when you become an anti-Zionist, or even just in the earlier days, we use different language at different periods of time in history of JVP. So even being against the occupation, let's say, or saying that Israel is an apartheid state, it often requires you to break from the community you've grown up in. And you may find yourselves really at odds with your rabbi or your teachers or your parents or your family or the community you grew up in. And you can't ask people to do that just because of the merits of the argument. You have to offer them somewhere else to land. And so, I continue to think that one of the reasons that JVP has had so much success in building up such a mass movement at this point is because we're offering, and I say we still are, I'm still a very active member of the JVP New York chapter. That's been a very beautiful coda to being the executive director. And I think it's a tribute to the fact that JVP really is a grassroots movement membership organization, and that we can all move in and out of positions of leadership in different ways at different times. But that one of the most important things it does is offer a place for, in our case, as Jewish people, a place to be fully Jewish and to fully embody our political values. And for those of us who want it, to be able to have ritual and observance and meaning, and to be able to embody that Jewishness in a way that doesn't feel antithetical to that. And not everyone in JVP, I should say, cares about that exactly. Like, there's a million different ways to be Jewish, and JVP encompasses all of them. But no matter what, I think there is at that core that wanting to feel that we can bring our full political selves to the work that we're doing, as well as our spiritual selves, and however we interpret that.
That's one of the things I think is important, Rebecca, about Jewish Voices for Peace as an organization, is as a model organization. To me, it's a new model of communalism. I grew up in an age where to be a leftist was to be anti-communal. And you mentioned Hindu Rights for Peace. The phrase communalism in India is often taken to mean, hostilities between Hindus and Muslims or whatever. And I certainly grew up, my mother was a Christian convert to Judaism. My father was Jewish by background. My great-grandfather was a rabbinical judge in Russia. So I had this mixed background, but so I was sort of provisionally, I had a bar mitzvah. My visa is supposed to be stamped by that, but not everybody accepts that. But to be Jewish 50 years ago was, in my view anyway, in the view of a lot of leftists and peace activists of my generation, was to submit to tribalism, right? That was the whole thing. And by the way, I'm proud to say that I have a historic note. It's been more than 50 years since I was first called a self-hating Jew. So I guess one of the things that's inspiring to me about Jewish Voices for Peace, and there are several, is that it and maybe a couple groups in Great Britain and elsewhere are saying, no, communalism doesn't have to be a wall between you and other communities. It can be a bridge. And that to me is one of the great lessons. And then I'll stop talking, but I can tell you from conversations with Palestinians in exile, and I know you know this as well, because you speak to many of the same people, whether it's Palestinians in exile, Palestinians in the West Bank, Palestinians in Gaza. What you have done on behalf of the Jewish community at Jewish Voices for Peace has lifted their spirits and given them hope in ways almost beyond imagining. So that's why I say it's a kind of new communalism that reaches across boundaries instead of fortifying them. I think you get what I'm saying, right?
I absolutely do. And yes, it's been very moving, especially in the last year, when I think we've all experienced a lot of despair, to have been able to be in conversation with Palestinians who, have gotten some hope from seeing that we're stepping out as much as we are. But I think you've also hit on sort of a core tension, a creative tension, like a productive tension within JVP. And it's something that we talk a lot about in the book, this sort of concept of both and the way that sort of has driven both our analysis and our organizing and the way we think about things. And, saying both and is sort of this concept of that sometimes you have to hold two truths at the same time and live with the fact that they both can be true and figure out how to navigate around that. But it's important to acknowledge that it exists. And there is a tension in being a organization organized around identity when what you're organizing for is against the state that's also organized around that same identity, and that wields that identity as a way to exclude others. And so while building that sense of communal and political home for the members of the organization, we also had to think very carefully about how to not recreate the same dynamics as we're fighting against politically. And I think that, and we didn't always do it perfectly. Sometimes we erred too much in one direction or another. And I think you're very right that the way that we navigated that, when we did it at our best, was when we were very aware of our accountability to Palestinians and to specific Palestinian organizations, because just like Jewish people, Palestinian people are not a monolith. Not everyone has the same strategies or goals or tactics. And so So we built long-term relationships with Palestinian-led organizations that helped guide our work, and also with organizations in other communities. So I think, but it is important to acknowledge that there is like there's a tension there that had to be part of the way we did our work most carefully, and when we did it at our best, like you're saying, we were able to identify the particular niche and what we offered value added by doing specifically Jewish actions or Jewish campaigns or Jewish statements that would help the movement as a whole.
Yeah, and there's a sort of mirror image tension on the other side of, if I may call it, a divide in the Jewish community between.
We should call it a divide. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a hell of a divide, actually.
Yeah.
And
like the chasm at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. And on the other side of it, but that I don't think that's a divide is acknowledged very much. Jewish Americans, including pro-Israeli ones, are predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly politically liberal. But politically liberal means that the idea of a religious ethno-state should violate some fundamental principles you believe in. And so one of my theories about this is that the reason that people get so angry at folks like you and me and others is, and certainly other people have been more on the forefront than I don't mean to elevate myself, is that you're forcing them into a kind of cognitive dissonance that they need to break through if they're going to understand the reality of the situation. It's like I see so many people, the Democratic Party and elsewhere, who oppose the Christian right because they want to create a theocratic ethno-state, and then but they're adamantly for Israel. Well, what is that as presently constituted, if not a theocratic ethno-state? And I think when you point that out, I think people have a tendency to reflexively get angry. How does my theory sound to you?
I think your theory is right on. And I think that, something we used to talk about a lot was this conception of being PEP, which is Progressive Except Palestine, which
Right.
sort of encapsulates what you just said. And I think, it's been interesting over the years as politics have evolved. In a way, the concept of being progressive except Palestine, I think, should never have been. I use it a lot myself. I'm not exempting myself at all. In the way, we should have never those of us on the left should never have accepted it, because you can't really be progressive or really be on the left if you're making, as you're saying, a carve out for an ethno-nationalist state. That's just not a thing. You know what I mean? So it's kind of a dubious concept, but it did describe something real, which was the fact that, as you're saying, that at least the non-Orthodox Jewish community in the United States has largely been liberal on almost every issue, except for Israel. I think one of the things that has happened since the genocide began 15 months ago is that concept of being progressive except Palestine is largely dead, or if not dying. That the sort of cognitive dissonance that you just described is forcing people to choose like fascism or anti-Zionism, or essentially. There's a few people who are still sort of desperately clinging on to, trying to cling on to the middle, but it's just not supported by any of the facts. You just can't call yourself progressive when you're supporting a state that's engaging in genocidal acts on a daily basis. So I think that concept is dying in this genocide, and I think that's actually a good and productive thing.
That's so interesting, Rebecca, because in a sense, history has made this go time on this issue, especially, I think, for the Jewish diaspora, because, and I'll give you, there are still holdouts. I'll give you an example. I'm in an online discussion group with progressives. I'm not always sure what that word means anymore, but progressives. And somebody said something very snide after Trump was elected. Oh, I hope those Arab Americans in Michigan are happy now, kind of thing. And I got very angry. I try not to get very angry, but I said, really, we're blaming genocide victims and their families now for the shortcomings of the American left? And someone else jumped in and said, oh, come on, we're all on the same side. And I didn't say anything, but I thought to myself, we're not actually. If you can support genocide, we've parted ways in some fundamental way. I may like you in other ways. You may be my relative. You may be, we may share a culture in common, and we do in many ways. I grew up in New York, and in New York Jewish culture, that's a strong culture with a show business element, academic element.
Yeah.
So we can connect on those levels. But you know what? I cannot say that someone like that is on the same side as I am. And that's an alienation if you don't have a community to go to, right?
Right. That's right. And I think one of the things I feel proudest of as I see more and more Jewish people in the United States, sort of very easily declaring themselves anti-Zionist, is that the work that we did over many, many years in JVP to create an anti-Zionist Jewish home and to build it into what it is, has made it so that it's not that lonely and not that difficult to become anti-Zionist and to live out your values during this period. And so I think that's, I feel really proud of that and feel like it's a really important contribution.
And it's a big deal because, it actually helps Judaism and the Jewish community because, I basically stopped considering myself Jewish, not only because I had so many Christian relatives, I lived with them at one point growing up, but I just felt alienated. I think my final break was when our god kids, they're twins, had a bar and bat mitzvah. So this would have been, I guess the 1990s. God only knows there have been so many attacks now, but that was the day that every rabbi read from the pulpit. Maybe it was early 2000s. Yeah, I'm sure it was 2000s. A letter that someone had read that they thought was so clever about, you don't like us bombing them, but, just horrific, offensive. And I got in an argument with the rabbi after it. Fortunately, my guy kids and their parents were all for it, not against it. But the rabbi began, and this is why I bring it up. The rabbi began by saying, I'm about to talk about Israel, and if you don't like it, you can leave. And then he launched into this monologue, and I went up to him afterwards and said, you offered me a chance to leave, but then you didn't give me time enough, so I had to listen to you. And I'd never do that. He said, well, you can leave now. And I said, I don't have to because you're not talking anymore. But that's not me, right? I'm not that confrontational. But that notion, that sentence to me encapsulated something about the community as it existed before people like Jewish Voices for Peace, which is, you don't like it, you can leave. At one point, I know we were looking for a religious home for our kids, and one of the major famous synagogues in the country said, we're open to discussion on every matter there is except Israel and its actions. It's like, you know what? And this was the 2000s also. So, you know what? I'm folding now. And so you have done something very important because you need your people around you if you're going to wage the fight. And if your identity is grounded in Judaism, you need your cohort. And your chapter 1 of the book is building a political home. I think everybody needs a political home.
Yeah. Yeah. And the story that you just told is so sadly such a common one, and I actually also remember having a conversation with a rabbi in New York, and a thing that she said, and she wasn't that far on the left, honestly, but she was always very open to conversation. And I always remembered her saying this. And she said, in my congregation, my experience of Jewish community is you can go to the rabbi, you can talk about not believing in God, you can talk about not believing in almost anything about Judaism. But if you say that you don't believe in Israel, that's the line. And, and if you think about the cost that has on spiritual and communal life, I mean, it's really quite tragic. And I will say, not as tragic as the genocide in Gaza. And I think that's one of this sort of productive tension. If Alissa was here as my co-author, she's a rabbi. She's thinking a lot about building what kind of Judaism is going to be built on the ashes of this moment, because it really is such a rupture in terms of the level, I think, of betrayal that we feel from Jewish communal institutions. I will say that I've been in opposition to the Jewish mainstream for many, many, many years. I wouldn't have thought that I had any residual feelings of trust or shared values with them, but I found myself truly shocked to find out that there really were no red lines, that we could go this far and they will still support what Israel is doing. And I think, it was interesting to me to realize that I still had a bit of naivete within me about what the organized mainstream Jewish community is about. And I think it's important for us to be able to tend to our spiritual selves and our communal selves and the people that we belong to. And of course, we're also engaged in fighting a genocide, and our primary commitment has to be to ending the genocide. So there's also that both and again, I don't think one needs to be played off against the other, but it's important to be able to have that both and of remembering that that's our primary fight right now, is stopping the genocide. A corollary to it is continuing to fight for the Judaism that some of us want to come out of the ashes of this moment.
And I think a key part of that is, well, two key parts of it: teachability and learnability. The ability to teach and the ability to learn. I had to, for all my years of radicalism, I had to learn, for example, to get comfortable with the word Zionist. Yeah. Even when you and I first met, I would just cringe a little bit at that word, because I had spent a lifetime being told that Zionist was a synonym for Jew, hated Jew, awful, that it was the same as insulting Jews to call them Zionists. It was an anti-Semitic term. So I've had to learn a lot over the last 20 years or so, including, to get to the point where I can say it's a religious ethno-state, and that you can't compensate a people for an atrocity by committing an atrocity against another people. It seems so obvious in retrospect, but without my willingness to learn, and I'm not bragging on myself, it's just, I'm a curious person, but and you got to be willing to teach where people don't want to hear, right? And that's the hardest part of all, because you have to say, look, this is the way it is. And if you don't want to hear me, you don't want to hear me. For me, the hardest part, and I haven't figured this one out yet, is dealing with irrationality. There comes a point where it just descends into the irrational, the conversation. People aren't making sense anymore in their defense. And I think at that point, I have to learn how to bail and not get triggered, because it's not going anywhere. But what do you think?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we're all always learning, right? We're all always evolving. It was interesting when Alissa and I were writing the book, we had some trouble with nomenclature, because, by the time we left JVP, we were a formally anti-Zionist organization. When we both started JVP, we're an anti-occupation organization. And so we were like, as we're writing this in 2022, how do we refer to the work of JVP in the past to not be confusing? Which I just think is like an interesting reflection on remembering that we're all learning and evolving all the time. And it's important to be open to that. And like you're saying, you need a community around you to learn. And I think many of us who were brought up in Jewish community and learned those same lessons that you're talking about had a lot of unlearning to do. And we need to do it in a place where we could be in community and ask the questions that we had to ask in order to be able to move to the next stage. And I also think it's fair for Palestinians to not have to play that role or be there in the room or have to be the ones to process with those of us who are figuring it out. And that's one of the roles also that JVP plays, is to give a place where people can have that political development, in a place where it's not requiring Palestinians to have those conversations over and over and over again, or subject them to that kind of questioning. And so I think that's an important role that JVP plays. I also, it's been interesting for me personally in the last 15 months. I have felt a frustration in the sense of, I just lost patience. I guess I would say I lost patience with people. I was like, if you can't see what's happening literally in front of your face every day, nothing I say is going to move you. And I would rather be out in the streets, at Grand Central Station, or it's the Statue of Liberty, or on Wall Street, organizing a action that has an impact on the media and that reaches the people of Gaza, with the people that are already there. That feels like a more productive and just emotionally available use of my time right now. And I'm not saying it's the only right way. I'm just saying, for me, that was what I came to during the course of this genocide, I ran out of patience. There are other people who still have the patience and are still having those conversations with people, and I'm so grateful to them. I'm so grateful, and that includes within JVP. And I'm starting to get back to being able to have those conversations with people. But I think, it's important to remember that we all have our different capacities at different times, and there's different tactics at different times. And sort of, we need all of us, the people who are able to have those patient, calm conversations with people who aren't there yet, and the people who, are ready to be out in the streets. And JVP has grown large enough to be able to encompass all of those things. And I think, honestly, JVP has always been a learning organization. And, in the book, we talk a lot about the process of endorsing BDS and becoming anti-Zionist, and the ways that we had an internal process that really allowed people to come together to that conclusion, so that we were able to take a sharper left position while not losing members. And I'm very proud of that as well. So that kind of work is really important, but not everyone has the capacity to do it all the time. And I've found over the last 15 months that I haven't. But and I think JVP at what it is has always been an organizing organization, but what it has really done is offered a political home for the people who are ready. And the people who are still questioning still have a lot of work to do.
But I will say, and I don't mean to interrupt, but I will say that even for the people who are still questioning, an organization like JVP lets them question in more safety. Knowing that they're not
trying to avoid the word safe space because I'm over it. But
right. I didn't say safe space. Now, in my defense, and I'm not thinking safe space. Actually, I'm thinking safe thoughts, which is a little different because there was a time these were not considered safe thoughts. What's this? Maybe the Zionist stuff isn't so good. I've never written about this because I didn't want it to feed an anti-Semitic trope. But when I was in Hebrew school, a rabbi was talking about our obligations to Israel. And I said, what if Israel and the United States went to war? Smart ass little 12-year-old. And he said, that would never happen. I said, yeah, but what if it did? It would never happen. Yeah, but what if it did? He said, we'd be on Israel's side. That feeds into the anti-Semitic trope of double loyalty. Looking back, I think he was just not a very gifted theologian.
Right.
But that stuff stays with you, right? And then 10 years later, you're a student radical and you want to, you start to question it. Oh, no, I'm not going to walk away from my family, my community. And even now I have a little bit of, well, I don't want to disrespect my ancestors too much. But so having a home, you talk about, what's the phrase in chapter 6, growing while sharpening our politics. So that's kind of what I mean about it. Safe thoughts is, as we grow, others can grow too. As we talk to people who have ideas that one generation of Jews might have called Meshuggah or worse, that there are teachers, right? I mean, I'm more like you, I have to walk away a lot of the time or I lose it. I don't know if you lose it, but I have lost it on occasion. But they do teach us what we're up against and, how to distinguish the person who has enough of an open mind from the person who's just so invested.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. And one thing I will just say is, in terms of disrespecting our ancestors, I think one thing that's very important about sort of the Jewish anti-Zionist world right now is to remember that there were always, as long as there was Zionism, there was Jewish anti-Zionism. And the JVP statement, when we became officially anti-Zionist back in 2018 or 2019, I think did a beautiful job of sort of honoring our ancestors who were anti-Zionist. You think about the Bund, which was the most powerful and organized socialist movement in Eastern Europe, and they were proudly anti-Zionist. And so, I think what it felt important to us also, again, for that feeling of, because nobody wants to disrespect their ancestors, but to remember that we have many ancestors and that we should honor the ones who held those same political values. We can honor them too, as anti-Zionists, and not to think that, we're going against everything about Jewish history. We're actually not. There's always been a strain of Jewish history. First of all, Zionism is very young in the grand scope of Jewish history. But in the time since there's been Zionism, there was always Jewish anti-Zionism.
I'm so glad you brought that up. It actually makes me feel better because it's true that in the 19th century, I think European Zionism was, if anything, a fringe movement in
It was a
Judaism.
fringe movement. That's right. Yeah.
And the people who call themselves Zionists in this country or Great Britain or France, they're not in a hurry to move to Israel. So it was a fringe. And my great grandfather, the rabbinical court judge, he probably was anti-Zionist now that I think about it, because this was a novel interpretation of scripture at the time, among other things. And of course, the other thing people don't remember is that Zionism was largely a secular
Right.
movement.
Right.
And the founders advocated social democracy for Jews and nothing for anybody else. So, but they were anti-religionists, if anything. And I doubt Benjamin Netanyahu in his heart of hearts is deeply religious. And this is not about theology, it's about power.
Yeah, and it's a nationalist movement. I mean, Zionism emerged during the heyday of nationalism, like you're saying, in the 19th century, when colonialism was seen as a good thing by the empires in which Zionism was born, in Europe, and really was modeled on that sort of colonialist and nationalist model, which was in vogue at the time. So, just to remember that we're also part of these sort of larger currents of history. I think it's been interesting for me to realize, which I really hadn't until recently, which is funny, that especially in the United States, like I in particular, I was born after 1967. And so I'm particularly of a very specific Jewish American generation that was Zionist, that was very Zionist from the beginning, because after the 1967 war was really actually when the Jewish American community turned completely Zionist. Up until then, the Reform movement, which is the largest non-Orthodox movement in the United States, had been anti-Zionist. It had a long history of being anti-Zionist. But that sort of hegemonic power of Zionism and the idea that Zionism and Judaism are intertwined is not actually very long. It's about the length of my lifetime, and I was steeped in it, and it sounds like you were steeped in it.
Yeah.
The generations before us were not steeped in it, and the generations after us are not steeped in it at this point. So, we need to remember, similar to the way you can sort of, if you were born in post-World War II America, you could think that like, oh, the American dream is attainable if you're a white person. You know what I mean? Because lived in a very specific historic and economic period in which that was actually, an exception, not the rule. But if you live in it, it feels like the rule. But I think that it's important for us to remember that this is a very, very specific and I think limited moment in time.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Rebecca, I feel we had a great discussion, maybe not enough about the book, but and I feel bad about that, but talk about nurturing partnerships. You talk about how to really fight anti-Semitism and its weaponization, which is a major theme of my writing, the weaponization of anti-Semitism, which is a horror because it is preying on the multi-generational trauma of a people in order to produce another genocide for another people. I mean, that to me is as ugly as it gets. And but your conclusion is what will you have Weathering Repression, and then Solidarity is the political version of love. I guess just in conclusion, this is not going to be easy, what we have in store for us. The forces of repression were stunningly powerful under a Democratic president in a way I would never have expected. I mean, I would expect Joe Biden to be a Zionist, but I never would have expected the censorship, the violence against protesting students, the media lies, the whole, media, military, industrial state arraying its forces against, loving young people in tents. I didn't see that coming. And now we got Trump. It ain't going to get easier, that's for sure. So any last thoughts on movement building, protecting, growing, etc.? Because we might be in for there may be a ceasefire. They say there's going to be a ceasefire, but we'll see, and we'll see if it holds. but Palestinians need a lot more than a ceasefire. Uh, so, any thoughts on the road ahead?
Well, if I could just bring it back to the book for a minute, because I think, we
Sure.
did have a wonderful conversation, and I think we did touch on a lot of the themes of the book. And I think a thing that I feel really proud of about the book is that I do think it's going to be evergreen, in the sense that there's always more organizing to do, and we all need to, we all need to think about how to do that work best. And I think the era coming up, as the second Trump administration real fascism in the United States, real authoritarianism in the United States, like you said, at the very best, a very fragile ceasefire, which is supposed to be voted on more or less as we speak in the Israeli cabinet. We'll see how long it lasts. But there's organizing always has ebbs and flows, and you have these moments of immense upheaval like we've had over the last 15 months, but then it's important to pay attention to the moments when that upheaval is not coming. And so actually, I think about the power that JVP has had on the streets and, in the narrative and as partners to Palestinians and building movement over the last 15 incredibly crucial months. That is all a result of the work was done in the years beforehand. And we had other moments in the 2009 war against Gaza and the 2014 war against Gaza. People come in during those movements, but then the responsibility to do the political development and the leadership development and all the other kinds of analysis that enable us to be out in the streets powerfully in the moments that we need to is part of the ebb and flow of organizing. And so I hope that the book will be a tool for organizers and people who want to be organizers, to think through how to, um, be strategic, be tactical, and be committed for the long haul, and to think about how to make it sustainable, because these are never short fights. These are lifelong fights, and it's our responsibility, to stay in them in whatever way that we can, and to do that in the best way possible.
Our responsibility as Jews, our responsibility as Americans, our responsibility as human beings, right? So again, the book is Solidarity is the Political Version of Love, and I love that title. I think I said that to you and Rabbi Wise in a note. My guest has been Rebecca Vilkomerson. You can find out more about her at Rebecca, VILKOMERSON.com. Rebecca, thanks for writing this book. Thanks for your years of great work, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.